Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back for another live broadcast of the Kev Baker Show, coming to you from the smart city of Glasgow in Scotland. And at the speed of light, we're going to listeners down in Australia, back up and around in Alaska, over in Norway, back to Nebraska, and we do that right here on Truth Frequency Radio Network. And I feel like a child on Christmas morning. I really, really do. I've got butterflies for today's show, folks. That should give you an indication of just how looking forward to this show I am. And you know how I roll out there. 1,400 episodes in, shows 6 days a week. I dedicate the day of the show to that particular guest and their content. And that way it doesn't get too confusing for me. And every guest gets the same amount of time, the same amount of preparation. Only sometimes I'm left kicking myself. On occasion, you book somebody to come onto the show and you've got a general idea what they cover, what they get into, and you get an inkling if it's going to be a good one or not. I had that inkling, but I had no idea the wealth of information that today's guest is bringing to the show to share with you, the audience out there. And like I always say, I provide, you decide. And I know there'll be some people out there who are saying, but Kev, you had somebody on the show not that long ago who came on and totally dismissed the idea of post-flood giants. And I certainly did. But remember what I've always told you, folks. I provide, you decide. And when it comes to something like the Bible, I find it fascinating that one document we all interpret in our own ways, and we all have our own ways of stringing the dots together. And that's why from time to time it will almost sound as if we've got conflicting information coming onto the show. And it will conflict. But it's up to you and your discernment. And discernment is always key in all of this. To take the information and then you do your research. And more importantly, take it to your heart. Take it to God. And then, and only then, you'll know where the truth lies. So like I say, tonight we're going to be getting into some wonderful topics. We're going to be talking about giants, gods, and dragons. And that's the title of today's guest's latest book. I say latest book because he has written so many, and all of them you could do probably 5 to 10 shows on. And I really hope that between myself and you, the audience out there today, by checking out our guest's website, checking out his work, hopefully, fingers crossed, and I've sent prayers up to the big man as well, that Derek Gilbert is going to enjoy himself here today, because that way we'll be able to get him to come back again and share more of the information that he and his wife are putting together. And you've probably heard of Derek before, but if you haven't, he's the host of Skywatch TV, a Christian television program that airs on several national networks, a long-running interview podcast, A View from the Bunker, what a brilliant name, and co-hosts then weekly video programs, Sci-Fi Daily and Unraveling Revelations, with his wife and author and analyst Sharon K. Gilbert. And I was watching Sharon and Derek today on my namesake show, Jim Baker's show. Brilliant if you want to go and check that out as well. Listen, if you've got an hour or two on your hands and you're looking for content on YouTube, put Derek Gilbert's name in there. You're going to find something that's going to blow your mind. Now, Derek is a Christian man like myself, a husband and a father, and the author of the groundbreaking books Bad Moon Rising, an analysis of the spiritual forces behind Islam, The Great Inception, and The Last Clash of the Titans. Now, he also is the co-author with Sharon Gilbert of Giants, Gods and Dragons, a new take on end times prophecy that puts names to the entities called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and Veneration, a book on ancient ancestor cults that reveal hidden prophecies of the return of the evil dead at Armageddon. Derek has also co-authored The Day the Earth Stands Still with the amazing Josh Peck, with documents and which documents the occult origins of ancient aliens And you haven't come here to listen to me tonight. Either have I. I've come to listen to this man. He's here with us. He is live. His name is Derek Gilbert. Derek, long overdue, but welcome to the show, sir.
It's an honor to be here, Kevin, to help get in the mood. My lovely wife, Sharon, has prepared for us a nice cup of tea. So we're enjoying a tea and some Scottish shortbread, and looking forward to our conversation.
And you were over in Scotland last year, right? How did you enjoy that?
Oh, my goodness. It was incredible. I have never seen a place as green in my life as Scotland. Now, I know they call Ireland the Emerald Isle, but we have it on good authority from a gentleman named Gordon, who took us out on his boat in Loch Ness, that we've got a few shades of green here that could give the Irish a run for their money. So Sharon is of the clan Fergus, so this was a return to her ancestral homeland. And my ancestry is more English and Welsh, but I guess between the two of us, between Sharon and me, with my German ancestry as well, I think we represent, and Swedish ancestry, I think we represent all the people groups who fought over the British Isles over the last 2,000 years. And I've got except maybe for the Romans.
I've got the German blood in me, but with the Welsh, you've got the Celtic blood in you. So you'd have felt right at home up here in Scotland. And of course, Loch Ness.
Gorgeous.
How did you enjoy Loch Ness? Now, so you get an idea, I was born and bred on the southern bank of Loch Ness, and that's Fort Augustus. So for 18 years of my life in the shadow of the St. Benedictine Abbey up there, that's where I would be running around, playing on my bicycle, and there was the loch right on my doorstep. And you know how it is, Derek, when something is so close to you, it's so there, every day, it's part of your life. You never truly appreciate it until you go away. And now I've been away from there 20 years plus now. And when I do go back, I feel like a tourist. I get that whole kind of the romantic feeling in the Highlands. And I'll ask you, because I always say to people, it's like there's something in the air in the Highlands. It's almost supernatural, the qualities of living up there. And there's a lot of paranormal activity to support that. But did you feel any of that when you were there?
We did. And in fact, we're hoping to come back sooner rather than later, because one of the things that we are doing at Skywatch TV is we are sort of transitioning the Sci Friday weekly program into a new program that will launch within the next few months, called The Bible's Greatest Mysteries. And we plan to do some of the traveling that we've been doing, but rather than devoting it to our own sightseeing or leading other tour groups, we plan to do this and record a lot of video for the purpose of trying to offer biblical explanations for these mysterious sites, megalithic structures, things even like, the existence of cryptozoological creatures like Nessie. But while we were there at Loch Ness, we took an opportunity to drive along the southern side of the loch, and we found what is the name of the place?
Boleskine House.
Boleskine House. Thank you. I knew it started with a B, but I was going to guess.
So synchronistic. Before we came on air today, I went and done a live stream on YouTube to get the audience in the mood. Talked about the Leviathan, and I talked about the other monster of Loch Ness, and it was Crowley and Boleskine House. So,
and to talk about a supernatural event, while we were there, we were driving along the side, and our tour guide, a friend of ours that we met here, had visited that back in the 70s in his New Age days, when he was deep into the occult. He sort of made a pilgrimage to Boleskine House. So he'd been there once before, but couldn't quite remember how far along the shore it was. And we saw a couple of ladies walking along the road, along the shore, and assumed that they were local because they were walking and it was raining. But of course, we noticed it's raining a lot in Scotland.
That's the default position, Derek. Yep.
Yeah. Well, we assumed that they were local, and so he asked for directions. John did, and they told us, well, it's just a little further up. And so we drove up. We found it. We pulled out. Now, we didn't go inside the property. It was far enough away from the road that we would have felt like we were trespassing, but we did see the cemetery on the opposite side of the road from the where the house was located. And then these ladies walked up, and it turned out that they were not, in fact, local, that they had taken the bus from Glasgow, that they were there to pray over the property because they had read that the property was for sale and that they were wanting to pray against it and whatever spiritual entities might still be attached to that place. And so they said that we thought you were either cultists or Christians, and we were praying that you were Christian. Well, forgive my bad Scottish accent. Sharon is much better at that than I am. So anyway, we wound up praying with them in the Boleskine Cemetery, and they left some scripture that they had written down from Isaiah 60, and they had put it in a bag. It was the scripture that Jesus proclaimed in the synagogue in Nazareth. This is
you're giving me
goosebumps.
You're giving me goosebumps, Derek, because that graveyard I was explaining to the audience on the pre-show stream, it's full of the clan name McGruer. That's literally my whole family. So Boleskine Estate is on the ground that like my family all were brought up for hundreds of years. And to hear about you being there, and I don't want to take up too much of the time, but I had an experience at Boleskine after the fires took place. Idiot. My own fault, Derek. I went in there thinking I was a Ghostbuster, calling things out, myself, my brother, and a friend. And all three of us took something home with us from that place. And that led me to coming back to God, actually, because like I was explaining to you before the show, I cover all topics here, and I was very much the nuts and bolts scientific guy, into the archaeology. I wanted evidence of everything, right? But I tell you what, you cannot separate the spiritual and the physical world. And maybe it's only after a paranormal experience that people such as me, people that are so far away from it, you could call me atheist easily way back then, but that gives you a deeper appreciation for there being far much more going on in this world and the next. And just to bring you up to speed quickly, there was a news story today where the locals around Boleskine they're up in arms because 10 holiday chalets are going to be built on the property, and they're going to be starting classes for the Thelema religion. Now, in a world 2020, it's been chaotic. I think the last thing we need is a pilgrimage for occultists to go to start cracking open some of Crowley magic. But that's just my take on it, Derek, so I hope your prayer there, and everyone praying over that property, because I know it's been almost a global thing. People are paying attention to what's going on there, and I think it's no coincidence at this time, the way things are in the world, that we see somewhere like that resurging, coming back to, I don't want to call it past glory, but you appreciate the significance of that location from the other side, the dark side, the satanic side. And
well, that
on you go.
In fact is that in fact is something that we want to do more research on. We've proposed a project at Tom revolving around Aleister Crowley and the magical system that he developed, Thelema, which then was developed further by his former personal secretary, Kenneth Grant, into the Typhonian tradition, Typhonian magic. Typhon being a reference to the chaos monster of Greek religion. I won't use the term mythology because that really does a disservice to what the Greeks believed. They took their religion every bit as seriously as the ancient Hebrews did. Typhon was just another form of the ancient chaos monster that almost every ancient religion that came out of Mesopotamia, and I include the Greek and Roman religions among those. I mean, when you start matching up what the Greeks believed with what came from the Amorites in ancient Canaan, you can see, it's clear that the Greek and Roman religions came from Mesopotamia, and they all had a belief in an ancient chaos dragon or monster or serpent that had to be subdued by a warrior god who then created the natural order as we understand it. All of this points back to the original story in the Bible where Yahweh confronted Leviathan. And we see Leviathan mentioned a few places, cryptic references, but the point is that this Typhonian tradition that developed from chaos, or from rather Crowley and Thelema, is become chaos magic today. And Josh Peck and I referenced this in our book, The Day the Earth Stands Still, which on the surface is a book about the UFO phenomenon. When you start digging into it, we actually go into the spiritual sources behind it. We show link by link the connection to Crowley and Helena Blavatsky before him, to Eric von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods. The modern ancient alien movement is nothing more than repackaged theosophy. And chaos magic plays into this as well, as they believed, Grant believed, and the chaos magicians believe that chaos is returning in some form, and they somehow, and I think the irony is lost on them. They somehow hope to develop a system for controlling chaos. Now, how can you have systemized chaos? That's like having a square circle.
It's an oxymoron, yeah, it's craziness.
Exactly.
And I mean,
so
I believe that they also, their understanding was, where they were coming from was, you had to corrupt everything and make everything chaotic for their chosen one to turn up on the scene. Isn't that correct?
Order out of chaos, right? Ordo ab chao. And so that points to what we're seeing on the streets today. But the reason, I think, Kev, that Christians in general are so clueless about this, until something really obvious appears, like, for example, a television series here in the States called Lucifer.
Yep.
Like, oh, suddenly that gets people's attention. But there are a lot of things that are taking place on our streets that are even darker and more ominous, but most in the church are so de-supernaturalized in our worldview and in our understanding of the Bible that we completely miss it. For example, here in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement has been very open. You know, the co-founder, Patrisse Cullors, the founder of the Los Angeles chapter, very prominent chapter in the BLM movement, Dr. Melina Abdullah, had an interview earlier this year, back in June, where they openly discussed the spiritual nature of what they're doing. They believe that what they're doing is not a racial justice movement, it is a spiritual movement. And they described how this practice of saying their names, where they recite the names of those who have lost their lives in confrontations with the police, is then actually is more than just commemorating the dead, it is actually summoning the dead. And they describe this in the context of a religious faith that comes from Nigeria, from the Yoruba people of Nigeria, Western Africa. Well, in the book Veneration, Sharon and I went into great detail based on secular academic research showing how the veneration of the dead in the ancient world was central to the lives of the pagans who lived around ancient Israel. And in fact, it was brought into Israel. The prophets condemned it in a number of places, but most of us don't have enough historical knowledge or cultural context to understand why, for example, Isaiah condemned the practice of sacrificing amongst the tombs and eating the flesh of pigs. Well, okay, yes, it was declared unclean by God, but what we don't know, according to scholars, is that in most of the cultures of the ancient Near East, eating pork was forbidden. And in fact, the only reason pigs were even bred at all, according to some scholars, is to offer them as sacrifices to the dead. And there are references to this in Scripture that make this very clear, that this was a practice that was widespread, drew in the ancient Israelites, was condemned. And in fact, we argue in that book that the travelers mentioned by the prophet Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 11, in the context of the concluding battle of the war of Gog and Magog, one of the big prophetic topics for anyone who studies end-time prophecy, the travelers was just a euphemism used by the pagan Canaanites. And again, we document this from texts that have only been translated within the last 40 years by scholars who studied the ancient Amorites and the Canaanites. Travelers was a term that was used to describe the demonic spirits of the Rephaim. In other words, the Nephilim, the giants who were destroyed in the flood of Noah. They were known to the pagan neighbors of ancient Israel. They worshipped them, and they called them travelers because they traveled or crossed over from the land of the dead to the land of the living. Well, they were worshipped very much the same way in ancient Canaan as the Black Lives Matter movement is honoring the dead when they're summoned on the streets of America today. They pour out a drink
It's
offering, a
almost like
libation.
it's like an invocation. And I'm really glad you've brought this up, because right now in the UK, there's been a lot of controversy around a football team, a soccer team, as you would call it. All of our players over here, they're still virtue signaling and taking the knee for Black Lives Matter before every game. And we had one team, Millwall, who, when crowds are now starting to be allowed back in, they booed when the players took the knee. Now, the media, they totally jumped on the back or to the defense of BLM and called all the crowd racist. But the people weren't protesting, they weren't being racist. They were actually showing their disgust at Black Lives Matter, because this is beyond some anti-race kind of thing now. It's developed into political and, like we're hearing here, something very, very spiritual intertwined into it as well. And it was more a protest against the organisation, this thing that BLM has become and it's morphing into, than anything to do with race. So in the media over here right now, everyone's been painted as racists, that we're at that football game. We've got this huge problem, Derek, but it's a non-problem. It's a non-issue, because BLM are not out there to bring equality. Far from it. In fact, they call for an end to the family, but that's for another show. And I want to get...
Absolutely, yeah. They're all about the creation of chaos, because that is what they're about. It's all based on critical race theory, which is based on critical theory, which argues that there is no truth, that truth, absolute truth, doesn't exist, which is, well, that's chaos.
That's chaos. That is chaos. 2 + 2 = 5. That's that kind of chaos. But Derek, let me backtrack a little, because I was going to ask you, and before we go to the break, probably nice time to squeeze this in. How did Derek Gilbert get to be the Derek Gilbert that we see today? What kind of path led you to where you are now, Derek?
Well, unlike my normal friends when I was a kid and they were, at night with our little AM radios under our pillows, my friends would be listening to Top 40 radio, and I was listening to late night talk show hosts. That's what I wanted to do when I grew up. Got into radio when I was in college, but when you're 19 years old, nobody needs a 19-year-old talk show host, because you don't know anything. You're stupid. And so I went into broadcasting as a disc jockey. I was in Top 40 radio for a number of years, wound up working in Philadelphia, Little Rock, Arkansas, St. Louis as a program director of a station. Got fired by long-distance telephone call, which is not the worst story you'll hear from people in that line of work, but that started me thinking that maybe I was doing the wrong thing. So long story short, got out of the business, got back in 2006 after spending years in sales, steel sales in particular. Had an opportunity after Sharon and I created our podcast called Peering into Darkness, or PID Radio, went into talk radio and did that for about 18 months, got back out again, and went back into steel sales. But because of the podcast that we had begun in 2005, we met people like Tom Horn and L.A. Marzulli and Gary Stearman, and became acquainted with people in that world. And that led to an opportunity in 2015 when Tom Horn was looking for somebody to host the program that he wanted to launch. He wanted to move from just being a publisher of cutting-edge Christian books to a cutting-edge Christian television program. And I had been in sales at that point for about 20 years, had moved from inside sales to outside sales. Looking back, I can see all of this was to develop certain skills in terms of communication, because when you're on the radio, talking into a microphone is one thing, but actually being able to go in front of a group of people and teach is something else again. It's a little different. So we moved to the Ozarks from the area near Champaign, Illinois, in 2015. Helped to launch Skywatch TV. We've been doing this for 5 years. And again, in 2021, be kind of shifting a little bit as I'm turning over the hosting of the main Skywatch TV program to Joe Horn. And Sharon and I will be focusing on the Bible's greatest mysteries. Tom, God bless him, has encouraged the research that we've been doing into the gods of the ancient world and how that has influenced the Bible. And I feel blessed that we've been able to come up with some things. We've been shown some things, I think, by the Holy Spirit that help to make some sense out of some of the weird parts of the Bible, some of the disturbing parts of the Bible. The Old Testament is filled with things that if you don't understand the nature of this supernatural war, you would think that God is bloodthirsty, capricious, vindictive. But when you understand the war that we're in the middle of, suddenly the Old Testament begins to make sense.
You know, somebody said to me, Kev, forget everything you know about the Bible and think about it being a version of Lord of the Rings. It's a magical book, and we'll be back on the other side. Don't go anywhere, folks. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I am joined today by the author and host of Skywatch TV, Derek Gilbert. Now, you can check out a couple of websites. I've got gilberthouse.org. That's gilberthouse.org. And there's also the derekgilbert.com. Now, Derek, now we're back on the radio. Let the audience, the worldwide audience, know the best place to keep up to date with all things Derek Gilbert.
Well, Derek P Gilbert, middle initial Paul for my dad, Paul. DerekPGilbert.com or gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. That's where Sharon and I post our weekly Bible study, where we're going through the Bible verse by verse, and we go through in chronological order, which means we go through the first 10 chapters of Genesis, then we skip to Job, then back to Genesis, then we get into the Proverbs and Psalms, and then things start skipping around because we're going through the life of King David and reading Psalms at the same time that we're reading about why he was on the run. And so it's interesting, and especially when you begin to read the Old Testament with this idea that the small g gods of the pagans around ancient Israel were not imaginary, and the prophets and the apostles knew it. Suddenly, again, the Bible starts to make more sense. So you'll find that at gilberthouse.org.
It's like I said before we were going out to break there, somebody told me, Joe Joseph, he said, Kev, you've got to read it with a new set of eyes. Look at it like something like Lord of the Rings, where magic and all these different creatures and characters. And, you know, when I started to look at it from that perspective, it really did pique my interest again. And I've always been interested in things like the giants. I mean, who isn't interested in that topic? But let's get into it, Derek, because you have got the book Giants, Gods, plural, and Dragons. So what was the inspiration to begin with? What really made this book become a reality?
Well, it came from a couple of different directions. Sharon, back in 2014, wrote a book for Tom Horn's Defender Publishing called Ebola and the Fourth Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Now, she's been studying end times Bible prophecy since she was a little girl. She grew up in a church that taught that. I grew up in a very liturgical denomination, one of the Lutheran denominations, and we did not. Genesis and Revelation were kind of, out of the picture, and didn't really hear much about it. It wasn't until I was 35 that I actually heard some actual preaching on end times prophecy in church. But Tom Horn came to Sharon and asked, with the COVID-19 outbreak, if she could kind of revisit the concept and write another book based on the fourth rider of the apocalypse, the rider on the pale horse, and use that as kind of a launching point to discuss end times prophecy. But as she and I were talking about it, we thought, well, maybe we should do something that's a little broader than that, so it's a little more evergreen. We hope and pray that this pandemic will be past us once we get to the spring, just as the Ebola outbreak in West Africa back in 2014 faded pretty quickly after she wrote the book, thankfully. So we were kicking around some ideas, and we host a weekly video program for Skywatch TV called Unraveling Revelation, where we go through the book of Revelation and other end times concepts, and again, sort of apply this worldview that says that these entities that are described in the book of Revelation, the beast that emerges from the sea, the riders of the apocalypse, and so forth, that they're entities and not just concepts or symbols for things. So as we were kicking around ideas for the title, I came across a news item that you might have seen. Some players of the game Dungeons and Dragons became upset with the creators of the game, the company called Wizards of the Coast, because of the way the orcs were depicted. So you're familiar with the orcs as someone who's familiar with Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yep.
For viewers and listeners who might not be, the orcs were sort of a twisted form of the elves. If you read the backstory in the Silmarillion, written by Tolkien and published after his death, you see the way they were created was by the dark god Morgoth, Melkor, who took elves and tortured them, twisted them, and turned them into these things that were just inherently evil. They were brutish and nasty and violent and bloodthirsty and irredeemable. But the players of the game Dungeons and Dragons said, well, it's because their skin color is different, so this must be racist. And it's okay, you can slap yourself on the forehead and say, okay, they're totally missing the narrative here. They completely have lost the plot. And isn't this pathetic that these folks are taking this so seriously that they're actually protesting the creators of this game because of the way the orcs are depicted, relative to the elves, who are generally depicted as cultured, peaceful, educated, and good. Well, that is laughable, but it dawned on me that we Christians, according to survey after survey of American Christians, a fellow by the name of George Barna does polling of the attitudes and beliefs of American Christians for Arizona Christian University. And survey after survey shows that most American Christians don't actually have a biblical worldview. We don't really believe that the world is as supernatural as we should. I mean, if we believe in the Bible, we believe in a God who spoke the universe into creation, spoke everything into existence except for himself, that he came to earth, manifested as fully human and fully divine, which means, that's 200% miracle, literally came back to life after 3 days in the grave, miracle, and yet we're going to deny the existence of all of these other entities that are written about in the Bible, including the gods of the pagan world, the giants of the pre-flood world and post-flood, and the dragons that are written about, like Leviathan, the beast from the sea, and Satan. So that was pretty easy on the title, and that then allowed us to go into some more depth and broaden the scope a little bit more than just writing about the pandemic and the fourth rider of Revelation chapter 6.
I like how you approach things, because you bring the science, the archaeology, the kind of historical documents, you bring everything together to back up a lot of what you talk about, and that's something that really appeals to me, and I know it'll win over a lot of the audience as well, Derek. But if we start with the giants then, what can you tell us about the giants, both pre-flood and post-flood? What's your take on it?
Well, rather than try to walk in the footsteps and retrace the footsteps of people like Steve Quayle and L.A. Marzulli and Tom Horn, Timothy Alberino, who've been out there looking for the physical evidence of the giants, guys like Brian Forster and others who've been traveling the world trying to find the bones. We wanted to go after the texts. What did the ancient world believe about these entities? Did the pagan Amorites who lived around ancient Israel, did they know about these giants that were called Nephilim or Rephaim? And lo and behold, yes, they did. And not only did they worshipped them. They were an integral part of the worldview of ancient Mesopotamia. There was sort of like a three-tiered hierarchy in the spirit realm, in the minds of ancient Mesopotamians, Amorites. There were the family gods, the household gods, who had to be given offerings once a month. There was a ritual the Amorites called the Kispum. It was performed on the 30th of each month, which on a lunar calendar meant the night of no moon. The moonless night, that was the night when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. So they would summon the ancestors by name and pour out a drink offering. Does that sound familiar?
Yep.
In fact, this was so important that the eldest son of the family, who was the one who inherited the family estate, took responsibility for the family gods, for their care and feeding In fact, it was believed that if you went to the afterlife and did not have a descendant who performed this ritual for you, you were condemned to wander through eternity eating dust and clay. And see, now it makes a little more sense as to why Abraham was so stressed about not having a son and heir when he reached his old age, because he thought, he didn't have the understanding of the afterlife that has been given to us later in the Bible. His understanding of the world and the afterlife around him was shaped by the Amorite culture from which he came. So that's why he was upset. I mean, there are texts that have been found from the ancient world that describe people contracting with professional mourners and professional ritual performers to perform these rituals so that they wouldn't starve after they died. That's how seriously this was taken. Anyway, that's sort of like those spirits of the ancestors, sort of like the bottom level in the afterlife. Then you had the kings, the mighty men who were of old, who occupied the next tier. Those were the Rephaim. And when you read the text from ancient Ugarit, which is an Amorite kingdom on the coast of Syria, on the Mediterranean Sea, very close to ancient Antioch, you can see that the description of these creatures is very much like the very brief description we get of the Nephilim in Genesis 6. Genesis 6, verse 4, they're described as the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. That is consistent with how they're described in these pagan texts. And again, Kev, these have only been translated, some of them, within the last 40 or 50 years. So we're literally the first generation that has access to this outside information that kind of corroborates and helps make sense of the Bible. Then, of course, you had the great gods above this middle tier, the Rephaim, or the divinized kings who were of old, who were these Nephilim. What's really been astonishing is looking at the work of secular scholars. One in particular, he's from Estonia. His name is Amar Annus, A-N-N-U-S. Amar Annus has written a couple of papers that are really foundational to our research. One is on the, he documents and the origin of the hero cults of the Greeks. The title of the paper is something like, "Were there Greek Rephaim?" And he shows that the term used by the poets Homer and Hesiod, who wrote a lot of what we know about Greek religion, mythology.
Yeah, I don't like that word either. I don't like myth. Yeah.
It was their religion. So the term that he used to describe, that they used to describe the men who lived in the pre-flood golden age, when Kronos ruled in heaven. Now, Kronos was the king of the Titans, the old gods who were overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians and then banished to Tartarus, which is as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. That term for these men of the golden age, Meropes anthropoi, he showed derives from the Semitic root word behind the word Rephaim. In other words, the heroes of the Greeks, the demigods like Heracles and Theseus and Perseus and Bellerophon and Cadmus, they were the Rephaim. They were the Nephilim, the half-human, half-divine hybrids that the Hebrews wrote about in Genesis chapter 6, and then also in extra-biblical texts like the Book of Enoch. The Greek heroes, the Roman heroes, who attracted worship, the same as the heroes, the Rephaim of the Amorites, the same type of ritual meals at their tombs where they'd be summoned by name and so forth, drink offerings poured out. That practice among the Greeks and the Romans came directly from the Amorites of ancient Mesopotamia. That was mind-blowing. So we didn't dig so much into, back to your question about the giants, we didn't go so much into their physical stature, because until we can find an archaeologist who has documented and unquestionably a skeleton that shows someone of extraordinary size in the right place and at the right time, we work with what we can show, unquestioned, peer-reviewed academic research. These entities were known to the pagans around ancient Israel. They were worshipped by them, and that worship was handed down to the cultures from which we in the West derive our civilization. Greek and Roman philosophy, literature, art, system of government, all comes from Greece and Rome. But their religious system was based on what came from Mesopotamia, and that was based on this worship of the ancestors, worship of these demigods, the heroes, the mighty men who were of old, the giants. And it's entered into the church, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches to this day, thanks to Augustine. Augustine in the early 5th century said, you know, this veneration of the spirits, the ancestors, that's not right, but since we can't get rid of it, let's see if we can find a way to make it more palatable. So Augustine argued that the spirits of the saints who had gone on before could intercede for us in this life, in the natural realm. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that says that, but Augustine, again, was trying to put lipstick on a pig, so to speak. And that's how the practice of venerating the heroes, the demigods, the Rephaim, was brought into the Christian church as the veneration of the saints. And it continues to this day.
Wow. Now, another thing I heard you talking about, and it's got a link to today as well, because you brought up how people reacted to the orcs and this whole kind of woke culture, people getting outraged over the stupidest of things, okay? It's led to a world where we live with over 150 genders now, and if that isn't confusing enough, well, trust me, there'll probably be another 150 on the way. But I heard your brilliant wife speaking with you today, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I always had this notion, you talk giants, Rephaim, Nephilim, always men come to mind. I'm toxic, I'm one of these old world kind of guys, you know, so I think of a man first. But she was talking about how they chose their gender when they fell, is that correctly? And she brought up a female one that really ties in with the spirit of what's going on in today's world, is that correct?
Yeah, she's done quite a bit of research on the ancient goddess called Inanna. Inanna was known in ancient Mesopotamia going back 5,000 years. One of the earliest of the deities worshipped in ancient Sumer, alongside the sky god Anu, the chief god of the pantheon Enlil, the trickster god Enki, lord of the Abzu or abyss, the moon god called Nana, later called Sin, the sun god called Utu, later called Shamash. Inanna, Ishtar, was one of the chief deities of the pantheon. Inanna was the first gender fluid entity on planet Earth, or at least the first one documented. She was the goddess of sex and war. And by sex, we're not talking about the goddess of love. I mean, in her later identities as Aphrodite or Venus, that's kind of how she's portrayed in the modern world. But she's gone by many names in many places across the ages. Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte in the Bible. There are indications that she could be identified as Artemis in the Greek world, as well as Aphrodite. Now, people can say, well, how can she be multiple entities in the same pantheon? And Sharon has a really good explanation for this. They're working in more dimensions than we are. We're limited to 3 spatial dimensions. They are not. And Josh Peck and I wrote about that in The Day the Earth Stands Still. Josh really handles that stuff because he's brilliant. But when you're dealing with, he uses the flatland as sort of a way to explain it. If you move your hand into a plane occupied by these hypothetical 2-dimensional creatures, they would see 5 discrete points. And as you move your hand through that plane, those points would grow and eventually come together into a single whole. And then as you pull your hand back out again, they would separate into 5 distinct points and then just disappear. To them, it's magic or violating the laws of physics. Well, no, it's just a multi-dimensional entity operating in a space where the occupants can only are limited in what they can perceive.
Now you're talking my language, Derek. I'm loving it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just imagine that you've got an entity who is who's operating multiple finger puppets and then identifying them by different names. Okay, Aphrodite and Artemis and Diana and whatever. So that's how we try to explain some of the confusing connections between these entities. We often get requests for charts or graphs or whatever showing how okay, Ares is Mars, is Chemosh of the Moabites, but what else? It's like, yeah, but that's where it really starts getting weird, because in one text, the Moabite stone, very famous text that helped decipher some of the ancient languages around Israel, the Semitic languages related to Hebrew. Chemosh, who was later Ares and Mars, was also equated with Athtar. Well, Athtar was a male war god known to the Western Semitic people, but in ancient Canaan, Athtar was just the male aspect of Astarte. Okay, how does that work? Male in the morning, female in the evening. Don't know. They're working in multiple dimensions. In ancient Sumer, Inanna was sometimes depicted as a bearded man. And there are hymns that have been preserved from ancient Sumer that praise her for being able to change women into men and men into women. And her worshipers, her temple servants, were transvestite, transgender. Some of them, when you translate the Sumerian name into English, probably couldn't repeat on this program. But that's who she was, the goddess of sex, carnal sex, and mindless, bloody violence. And you can make a really good case looking at the world around us today that Inanna, this ancient deity, gender fluid deity that was known in Mesopotamia thousands of years before Moses came down from Mount Sinai, she's the spirit of our age today. In fact, she's the one called in the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament, the Queen of Heaven. And interestingly enough, the Queen of Heaven is a term that is applied by some Roman Catholics to their concept of the Virgin Mary to this day. And again, this is not me saying this and trying to make a connection where none exists. This is based on what scholars with actual credentials have researched and written.
Yeah, I remember listening to a lot of Tom Horn, people like that, and what always blew me away is how Catholicism is almost like the opposite of what it portrays to be on the face of it. It's more worshipping the other side than it is worshipping God, you know, and this is something you see all the time there. Now, I'm loving how this conversation's going. There's another thing I want to ask you, I had it written down here today, and it includes talking about the fall. We've got the fallen ones, you know, but what's your interpretation of Adam and Eve? We find a serpent in there, and we've got the serpent, the dragon thing throughout the Bible as well we can get into. Talk to us about your interpretation of how that fall took place and then the fall of the fallen ones, wherever you want to take it from there, Derek.
Well, it, I think, has a lot to do with disobedience. It wasn't simply just, don't eat this piece of fruit because something magically bad happens when you bite into this fruit. I think there was something more there that happened. Pastor Carl Gallups has written about that in one of his books, where he suggests that there was some perhaps ritual that involved something very carnal that may have taken place. Now, he doesn't, that's not a theological hill he will die on, but it's speculative just to try to understand better what was going on with this this interaction with the so-called serpent. The late Chuck Missler theorized that when Adam and Eve were in the garden, that they may have had access to as many as 11 dimensions, and he pointed some work by some of the Jewish rabbinical scholars over the ages who went in that direction as well, and that when we were removed from Eden, Adam and Eve suddenly lost access to those 8 higher dimensions and were now limited to these 3 spatial dimensions that we're in.
Wow. So would that be fair to say then, would you, is the Garden of Eden, does it have a physical location in this world, in this realm?
We would argue yes, and in fact we argued in the book Veneration, and Carl, I know, argued in his book Gods of the Final Kingdom, or Gods of Ground Zero rather, that the most likely physical location on this earth for Eden is Jerusalem. And there are some reasons for that we went into in the book Veneration. 2 of the rivers that flow from the garden, the Tigris and the Euphrates we know of. Another one called the Pishon, a scholar by the name of Nicholas Wyatt, University of Edinburgh, pointed out was probably a reference to the Nile. So you've got Moses then naming the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Nile, the 3 most important sources of fresh water in the world in which Moses and the Israelites lived. And the final one is the Gihon, which is the only source of fresh water, the most important source in Jerusalem. So in a sense, what he was painting when he described Eden as he wrote the book of Genesis that is Moses, was describing sort of a cosmic description of Jerusalem. But it is hidden from us now. We do not perceive it because we have been kicked out, and the way to it has been blocked by a cherub, or keruv in Hebrew. And we describe in this book, and I've described a couple of other places, why this medieval or Renaissance idea that we have of cherubim as chubby little babies with wings is about as wrong as you can possibly get.
Yeah, I was going to say, are they not the little cutesy ones that, you know, you see them with the curly hair and they're playing their harps and
no.
like that?
No. Go to the British Museum and look at the big bearded, bulls, winged bulls there from the ancient palace at Nineveh, the Assyrian kings, the Lamassu. The cherubim probably looked like that.
It sounds like the gargoyles you get in a lot of European buildings as well, Derek.
Yeah, something more like that. They were seriously bad dudes you didn't want to mess with. So we're not going to get access back to Eden until the new heaven and the new earth. That's until Revelation 21, or possibly during the millennial reign. I'm open to more interpretation and understanding on that one. But yes, I do think Eden has a physical location. It's just hidden from us now.
Wow. I could keep this guy forever. I really could. You're listening to Derek Gilbert, ladies and gentlemen. Check out the website, gilberthouse.org. We'll be back after the break. 1 more hour with this amazing guest. Don't go anywhere. You know, over 1,400 shows and 6 years later, that theme tune, you know, the New World Order's going down, it seems to me to become more and more relevant the further we go into the future. It really, really does. And I've got a brilliant guest here with me today. His name is Derek Gilbert. You've probably seen him on Skywatch TV, been on Coast to Coast. I tell you, this man, he knows what he's talking about. He's got a book out right now with his wife as well. It's called Giants, Gods, and Dragons. Now, we've been touching on the giants, and I was talking about the Garden of Eden before we went to the break. And the fallen ones then, how did they fall? How did they end up down here with us? What did we do to deserve that?
That's a really good question, and we can only speculate as to their motives, but we have to think that when God created Earth and then created humanity, lower than the angels, but then granted us dominion over it. And this is a verse that I think trips up some people because of the English, the limitations of the English when you're translating from Hebrew. When God says, let us create man in our image. There are those who believe that that means God stands, he's a bipedal entity that stands about 6 feet tall and has, 10 fingers and 10 toes, whatever. That's not really what it means. Our friend Dr. Michael Heiser, who is a scholar of biblical Hebrew and Greek and a historian as well, and also a pretty good ufologist, interestingly enough, he says that the term actually means we are God's image bearers. We are his imagers, if you will, his moral agents on earth. So our role on this earth is to essentially have dominion over the earth as he has dominion over all of creation. And so you've got these, if you want to call them older brothers, the angels who have dominion elsewhere, presumably, created like us humans with free will, look down on this beautiful planet that God created and over which he placed us, and were jealous and decided to come down and take it away from us, apparently. And they came down, and perhaps it was the act of creation that stirred their jealousy. We really don't know. But according to the extra-canonical book of Enoch, First Enoch, we read that 200 of them descended at Mount Hermon and made a mutual pact. Their leader, Shemiyaza, said, I fear you will, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the book of Enoch in front of me, but essentially said, I'm afraid you're going to leave me holding the bag here. So let's all swear by mutual oaths and imprecations that we will do this deed. And so together they went out and we just get a very short description in Genesis 6, the first 4 verses. They took wives of any they chose, and from them came the Nephilim, the giants, the men of renown, the mighty men who were of old. The book of Enoch goes into more description and details how they taught us things that we weren't supposed to know. The art of necromancy, sorcery, divining the future by telling the stars, the cutting of roots, the making of potions, metallurgy, which led to the making of weapons, and so forth. Things that we might have learned on our own over time, but we weren't supposed to know. And for that, God condemned those angels and sentenced them to punishment. Now, we see references to this description in Enoch in 2 of the letters in the New Testament. Peter, specifically 2 Peter, chapter 2, beginning at verse 4, where he describes the angels who sinned. You know, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to, most English Bibles say hell, but the Greek word behind that word hell is tartarau, which means Tartarus. He thrust them down to Tartarus, where they remain in chains in gloomy darkness until the judgment. And when you read all of 2 Peter chapter 2 in context, you see that the sin for which these angels was condemned was a sexual sin. Likewise, in the short epistle of Jude, beginning at verse 6, he describes the same incident and describes the angels who are in chains in gloomy darkness, and then compares their sin to the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and sexual immorality. So it's clear that there was some sort of forbidden commingling of the seed of the divine with the seed of human, which produced these half divine, half human hybrids. It was almost as though these rebels had decided to create their own children, if you will, to replace the children that God created through Adam and Eve, humanity, to take over the earth. And to stop that, to put a stop to that, God sent the flood of Noah and wiped out this race before it wiped out all of humanity. Now, the book of Genesis says there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the angelic rebels, went into the daughters of man. Again, referring back to Dr. Michael Heiser, he points out that the word translated when in Genesis can also be translated whenever. So whenever the sons of God went into the daughter of man, we had these hybrid giants, the Nephilim, that were produced, which may explain the presence of giants in the land after the flood of Noah. So
there's a lot of myths. Again, there's that word myths about giants over here in the UK. There's stories about giants everywhere. That this giant race, and I know I opened up the show, and I've got a good friend, Ken Amy, and he makes a very strong case for it being pre-flood. And to question that is to say God got it wrong with the flood. But I've also, you know, like I said to you before the show, I like to look at things from all angles. And I still think there's a good case to be made for this global population, civilization, call it what you will, but they were here, there, and everywhere. And one thing I was going to ask you is mountains. You mentioned it there, right? They came down on a mountain. Moses goes up a mountain. You've got the Tower of Babel reaching into the heavens. What is it with, and this might sound like a really silly question, Derek, but what is it with mountains in the Bible? They seem very significant, you know?
Well, actually, that's not a silly question at all. And that was the reason I wrote my first nonfiction book called The Great Inception, kind of a play on the term The Great Deception. But it really is about the significance of mountains in the biblical narrative. And it kind of went through chronologically in order. You know, what mountain was first? Well, that was Eden. When we read in Ezekiel chapter 28, we see that the rebel in Eden, the serpent, the word in Hebrew is Nachash, which interestingly is used interchangeably a couple of places, the book of Numbers and the book of Isaiah, with the root word behind seraphim. So you get the idea that these Nachash, seraph, these flying fiery serpents,
here we go.
Were angels that had a serpentine appearance. But, you know, if you had to come up with an English word to describe a flying fiery serpent, what would that be?
You know it.
Dragon.
It's a dragon. Yep, there we go.
But Eden is also described as a mountain in Ezekiel chapter 28. And so humanity and the rebel from Eden ejected from the mountain. And then, so we go through the history of the Bible and show the importance of these mountains in the narrative. Mountains in the pagan world were believed to be the domain or the abode of the gods because, I presume, because they were pristine, they were hard to reach, they were well watered compared to the dry and dusty lands, most of Mesopotamia. So, of course, being gods, they get all the best stuff. But it's interesting that even in southeast Iraq, which is where the Tower of Babel was built, and I argued in the book, The Great Inception, and we kind of recapitulate that in Veneration, that Babel was not at Babylon. It was actually at an ancient city called Eridu, which is remembered by the Sumerians as being their very first city. It was the location of a ziggurat, a temple to the god Enki, and we argue that the biblical Nimrod, who's presumably the builder of the Tower of Babel, the second generation king of the city of Uruk after the flood, is to be equated with the Sumerian king named Enmerkar, who likewise was the second generation king of Uruk after the flood. The Sumerians remembered the flood. There was a time when the flood swept over. And there's a poem that survives from Sumerian literature called Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, possibly a reference to the ancient land of Urartu, rather, which is Ararat by a different spelling. So, you know, far north in Armenia. The point of the poem is that this king Enmerkar, Nimrod, was trying to put the squeeze on this king of Aratta to get building materials to build up the temple of Enki as an abode of the gods, to turn it into a gleaming mountain as an abode of the gods. Well, as I mentioned in an earlier segment, this god Enki was the lord of the Apsu. His temple was called the Apsu, which means the house of the abyss. So what we've got here is evidence from this poem, Sumerian king list, that this second generation king of Uruk tried to build up an abode of the gods directly above the abyss. On top of that, an archaeological dig at Eridu in 1949 found 18 levels to this temple to the god Enki. The bottom, I forget how many, the bottom 8 or 10 were below an 8-foot thick layer of silt. What would deposit an 8-foot thick layer of silt? A really big flood, of course. They also found that the top level, what they call level number 1 of this temple of the Absu, the house of the abyss, would have been the biggest and the largest ziggurat in all of Mesopotamia, larger than the one that Saddam Hussein rebuilt at the city of Ur for the moon god. But it was never finished. They found that at some point, and for some unknown reason, it was suddenly abandoned and very quickly covered over with sand. Now, the city was reoccupied later, but the temple was never really rebuilt to the scale it had been before. And we see at the end of Genesis chapter 11 that the city was abandoned. They left off building the city after the confusion of languages. So there's some archaeological evidence to suggest that there's truth to this story. The point of the Tower of Babel, what it was an attempt to construct an artificial mountain as an abode of the gods. And we've got other ones that I talked about. Mount Hermon, of course, where the Watchers descended. Mount Zaphon in near what is now it's called Antakya in Turkey, in ancient Antioch. That was known in the ancient world as the home of Baal. That's where Baal's palace was located. Of course, Mount Sinai was key in the creation of Israel as a nation and the giving of the law to Moses. But
now, was Baal one of the gods, plural, that you talk of in the book?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
He's the storm god of the Western Semites. In Sumer, he was called Ishkar. Marduk also has some storm god attributes to him. But when you look at the religions of the ancient world, there's a common theme where you have a sky god originally, who is almost created from the primordial chaos. He fathers a number of children. is replaced by a grain god or a creator god. In Sumer, it was Enlil. For the Hittites and the Hurrians, it was Kumarbi. For the Greeks, it was Uranus, and followed by Kronos, leader of the Titans, Caelus and Saturn, in the same sort of pattern. And in all of these cases, they were replaced by a storm god. In Babylon, it was Marduk. In Canaan, it was Baal. In Greece, it was Zeus who took the place of Kronos. It was Jupiter who replaced Saturn in Rome. The same pattern over and over again. Even the Hurrians and the Hittites had a similar story with Teshub, the storm god, replacing Kumarbi, the grain god. This was a common pattern repeated over and over in these very distant places. We even seen the same thing in the Indian pantheon, in the Slavic pantheon, the Norse pantheon, where Thor, the storm god, takes over for Odin. So it's a different retellings of the same storyline, I think, but all of it, again, is a twisted version of the actual supernatural history of the world that we see in the Bible, where I think that this sky god, Anu or Uranus, is sort of a twisted version of Yahweh of the Bible. This was the version that was given to the pagans by these fallen angels that the pagans called gods.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Talk about blown away. It's not very often I am lost for words, sir, but you are totally on it. Now, let me ask you then, let's get into the fiery angels, the serpents flying in the sky, the dragons. Talk to me about what you've included in your book there and what you've uncovered, you know, to kind of back up what we hear in the Bible.
Most Christians, if you were to ask them the question, who was the first rebel in history, would say Satan, the rebel in Eden, the Nakash, the serpent in the garden. Okay, I can see why you'd say that, but when you look at Genesis 1, verse 2, we actually get a picture of another rebel who we argue is not only the first, but the last rebel encountered by God. The first one he had to subdue, and the last one that will ultimately be defeated. We read Genesis 1, verse 1, and I read from the English Standard Version. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, the earth was without form and void. And we go into a little bit of detail in the book as to why we believe the earth was made formless and void. And darkness was over the face of the deep. Now, the word there translated deep from Hebrew is tehom. Tehom in Hebrew is a cognate, that means same word, different language, as the Akkadian word temtum. Temtum, in turn, is a cognate for Sumerian Tiamat. Tiamat was the primordial chaos monster or chaos dragon, chaos serpent in Sumerian and Mesopotamian religion, the equivalent of the Bible's Leviathan. So we think that's what we're seeing here. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. What we see here in the first two verses of Genesis is God, the Creator, subduing chaos and doing it without any trouble at all. It's like down, like you're speaking to a dog. In the Mesopotamian story, Tiamat was defeated, but only with great difficulty. And depending on when the story was told, because again, the pantheon changed over time. For a while, Anu was the chief god, and then he was replaced by Enlil, and then he was replaced by Marduk. And every time the story was retold, whoever was the king of the pantheon was the one who defeated Tiamat in the early days. But the point is, the story had the same theme, a warrior god, in some cases Ninurta. In western Mesopotamia, among the Canaanites, it was Baal, had to defeat this chaos monster, this chaos dragon, in order to, for the natural world to be created or brought into being as we understand it. And now in the Baal cycle, these are texts that were found at the kingdom of Ugarit, which was destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age, part of the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, right in the middle of the period of the Judges in the Bible. So if you're looking at the book of Judges, it was about the time that this kingdom in northern Syria was being destroyed by invaders from Greece and western Turkey. The Baal cycle is derived from clay tablets that were preserved when that city was destroyed, and the fires of the burning city baked the clay tablets and kept them preserved for like 3,200 years. In the Baal cycle, it is described how he defeats the sea god called Yam, Y-A-M-M. But Yam is given a number of different epithets or nicknames, including Lotan, which is an alternate form in Semitic for Leviathan. Lotan, another is called that fleeing serpent, that twisting serpent, and another called the encircler with 7 heads. Now that's interesting for a couple of reasons, because the encircler conveys the sense of this the snake eating its own tail, like the Ouroboros, which is a very ancient and occultic symbol. It also relates to how we see the Milky Way in the sky as a snake eating its own tail. But the encircler with 7 heads, this points to another theme that we see throughout ancient Mesopotamia, and this idea that a 7-headed dragon must be defeated, was defeated early in order to bring about the natural realm, and has to be defeated again. It's not a coincidence that when John the Revelator wrote the book of Revelation, he's got not 1, but 2 7-headed dragons in the book of Revelation. First is Satan, who's described as a red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems, the crown of royalty. And then there's the beast that emerges from the sea at the beginning of Revelation chapter 13, which has 7 heads, 10 crowns, 10 diadems. And even though it's an oddly described creature, this is the thing that I did not know before we started researching this book. This beast, which is described as like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. Well, that doesn't sound like a dragon, Derek. Yeah, except if you were an ancient Mesopotamian, it would sound exactly like a dragon. The dragons of ancient Mesopotamia looked a lot differently than the concept that we have, which has been shaped by Hollywood over the last, 75 years. So our concept of what a dragon is would not have necessarily been recognized 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago when John wrote Revelation, but people from that part of the world certainly would have known what he was talking about here. So besides that, of course, as I mentioned before, you've got the description back in Numbers and Isaiah with references to flying fiery serpents. And we argue that those seraphim may have had some dragon-like qualities as well.
And of course, we had when the Christianity was spread to Scotland, we had Saint Columba telling the locals up there after one of his people had gone to cross the loch and get a boat to come back and get him. He was attacked by a great sea creature, a sea monster, something that sounds akin to what we're talking about with the Leviathan. Many of these monsters from today, I don't call them monsters, I call them cryptids. I would think, and I'll get you to touch on this before we go to the break, but would you be somebody that says the Bible definitely talks of supernatural entities such as cryptids, lots of them in there?
Well, there are some for sure that are hard to dismiss. Some of them, I think, can be put aside because of translations. The King James Bible, the translators did the best that they could with their limited knowledge of Hebrew at the time.
That's one of the things that turns me off from the Bible, and I know that might offend people that are Christian, but it's because of the translation, how much is lost. Then you talked about the book of Enoch as well. We've got the other books that have been what I call occulted from the humanity. When you've got the King James, and you mentioned royalty and reptiles a moment ago, and the two of them go hand in hand. So when I see a King James Bible, I kind of go back the way because I always fear that it's been played with. Does that make sense to you, Derek? Yeah.
It does, but here's the thing that that gives me comfort that the texts that we have been pretty accurately preserved. There's good reason to believe that the texts that we have, even the King James, has for the most part been preserved faithfully. There are so many citations of Scripture in the writings of the early church fathers that can be used to cross-check what we have in our Bibles today, that you really have to be a conspiracy theorist to believe that the Bible has been tinkered with to serve political agendas over the centuries. And I know that there are skeptics out there who firmly believe that. And, God bless you. I just wish you'd look at the evidence. I pray that you look at the evidence, because that just is not the case. For example, there are so many citations of New Testament Scripture by the early church fathers who wrote during the first 3 centuries after the resurrection, prior to the Council of Nicaea, okay, which is significant because there are a lot of people who still believe that the Emperor Constantine kind of imposed his interpretation on the New Testament. Not so. You could rebuild, if you destroyed, burned, and deleted every copy of the New Testament in the world today, you could rebuild the New Testament except for 15 verses, none of which have any bearing on doctrine from the writings of the early church fathers. So we have more manuscripts and older manuscripts to cross-check and cross-reference the biblical text than for any text from the classical or from the ancient world.
And now we've got AI as well. I was reading about MIT and an Israeli university. They're going to be employing machine learning to look at some of the texts that we haven't been able to decipher. And some people will say, well, they'll kind of, they could lie and it could totally alter the story that we know. But I tend to look at it the other way. It might actually back up. It might be more texts that go along the lines of confirming what we already know, Derek.
What would be really hilarious to see an AI so convicted by what it's reading and translating that it decides to accept Jesus Christ.
Well, you know, I think it's 50-50. I've always said, if you're convinced it can go dark, then it's a 50-50 flip of a dice, you know, whether it could go light as well. Maybe it'll realize that we do need saving from the people that create the AI. Probably another show altogether. But when we come back on the other side, I've got a few things I want to get into you with, because I'd never heard of anything called, and I would imagine there's listeners haven't heard of this either, the 70 weeks timeline.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now I've also, when I was getting into your information today, not very often you have people saying that they can name the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Now, I'm not going to get you to name them all on the other side, because I want people to get the book. I want them to really dive into this information you've put together. Because if people like this show, I can tell they're going to love this book. And we're also going to talk about the timeline. You talked about Leviathan. There will be this final battle. And again, no man knows the hour. So, you know, it's speculation island stuff, as I call it. But I'll be picking your brain about that. And is there social media where people can follow you, Derek?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Derek Gilbert. That's DerekGilbert. Also on Parler, Parler, Parler.com. Derek P Gilbert.
Give him a follow, folks. It's nights like this that I really do wish I was George Norrie and I had like 3 hours, maybe 4 hours, maybe even 24 hours. Derek Gilbert has got a new #1 fan, if you haven't already gathered that, folks. But no, all joking aside, Derek, thank you so much for taking time out today. First of all, for coming to join me here. I've thoroughly enjoyed what I've heard you say already. I've got the book ready for reading. I was saying to you before the show, I can't wait to get done with you, but only so I can get into your book in the nicest possible way. But I hope you've enjoyed the show so far, to the point where I'd love to get you on in the future, because you're somebody that I think we can learn a lot from, and it gives people something to think about. We provide, they decide. So I hope we can get back together in the future, Derek, because wow, you've blown my mind already.
Well, I appreciate that. You're very gracious. Would love to do it, and hopefully we can do it someday in your fair city there. We hope to get back to Scotland sooner rather than later.
In Smart City, Glasgow, they'll probably do it virtually before we do it any other way. Who honestly knows at this point? But that brings us nicely to where we're going to be going in a moment. But just let me remind the audience quickly that I can't top this show tomorrow night, but I can equal it, because we've got another new guest coming on. And his name is Neil Sanders, and we're going to be talking about Cambridge Analytica, data manipulation, and how, or why, the world's gone as mad as it has, and social media in particular, how it's played its role in that. So that ties in with the chaos and everything that's going on right now. I said on my stream earlier on today, you know, some people, if they were asked to sum up 2020 in one word, they would probably opt for chaos. It's definitely been chaotic. And that shouldn't be any surprise because there's a timeline in play here. But let me emphasize that no man, no woman, nobody we bring onto the show, and anyone who does say that they know, they don't. We can speculate, we can look at the information that's out there, we can relate it to current events, but it's all our interpretation. And anyone telling you that they know definitively what's going to happen, run the other way. That's red flag number one. And that's what I like about today's guest. He's already warned us when we speculate. Something I love on the show. Because it's only fair to people like you out there listening that you know that. Because we don't want you to repeat something thinking it's factual. And we've given you misinformation. Not deliberately misinform you, but just to get away from that vagueness. So I'm going to ask Derek now about the timeline. And first up, I'm going to ask him what on earth's name, or heaven's name, is the 70 weeks timeline. This is a new thing to me. I've heard of tribulation, pre-trib, post-trib, raptures. 70 weeks?
Well, this is and by the way, I agree with you wholeheartedly. In fact, I've got a novel out that's just been recently published, available at Amazon and on Kindle, in which one of the characters, who's a pastor, is trying to describe end times prophecy to a character who is raised in church, but one of the denominations like the one I was raised in that never taught end times prophecy, and said, look, anyone who says that they know the time, the day or the hour is probably selling something. Yeah. So I agree with you completely. The 70 weeks timeline is something that's used as a sort of a chronograph, a timepiece that has kind of marked not only the fulfilled prophecy of Messiah's first coming, but will begin ticking again to complete this timeline when he comes back for his second, or when he will come back for his second coming. The 70 weeks timeline is laid out in Daniel chapter 9, beginning at verse 24, where he's visited by an angel, Gabriel presumably, who tells him 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. Now, your people, we presume, means the Jews, which is why Sharon and I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. I'll explain that in just a minute. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. And then as we continue, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem and the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, this right here, leading up to the 62 or the 69 weeks, the 7 weeks plus the 62 weeks, the anointed one to be cut off is a reference to Jesus Christ. Well, a lot of Bible students, and Jewish and Christian, have looked at this prophecy to try to understand the meaning. The weeks that the angel Gabriel is talking about here are not just standard 7-day weeks. He's talking about weeks of years, 77s. So we would look at this and say, okay, 70 times 7, that means 490 years. So if we subtract 1 week, because that last week has not yet occurred. The Messiah was cut off, the anointed one, at the end of 69 weeks. So 490 less 7 would be 483 years, correct? Not so. This is one of the interesting aspects of the book, and credit to Sharon, who comes up with the really out-of-the-box thinking that goes into our joint writing efforts, Veneration and Giants, Gods, and Dragons, where she found the work by a gentleman by the name of Sir Robert Anderson, and the connection between Jack the Ripper, Mount Hermon, and this timeline of end times prophecy. The connection between Sir Robert Anderson and Mount Hermon is this. In September of 1869, Sir Charles Warren climbed the summit of Mount Hermon for the Palestine Exploration Fund, and he found inside a temple on the summit of Mount Hermon, which is the highest man-made place of worship on earth, by the way, to this day, a stela, That's an inscribed stone, a carved stone, standing about 4 feet high, 18 inches wide, about 12 inches deep. And on this stone in archaic Greek, the best scholarly translation, except for one, but that's coming out in a forthcoming book, so I can't spill the beans on that one yet. This Stila, and there's Sir Charles Warren, reads, by order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here. Well, as mentioned in an earlier segment, the Watchers, the sons of God who came down to Mount Hermon, Genesis chapter 6, swore a mutual oath that they would go ahead with their plan to corrupt humanity. Scholars agree. This stone that Sir Charles Warren located is a reference to the Watchers of Genesis 6 and of the Book of Enoch. Well, Sir Charles Warren brought that stone back to the British Museum. Now, when we were in the UK last year, Kev, we went to the British Museum and asked. It's not on display, unfortunately, but Sharon has included it as a plot device in her series of supernatural fiction called the Red Wing Saga, in which the stone was unboxed in 1870 and bad stuff started to happen. But
okay, now I've got another series of books I need to get into. Come on, man, what are you doing to me?
I digress. So Sir Charles Warren brings this stone back, reference to the Watchers, from Mount Hermon in 1870. Fast forward 18 years, 1888, he's the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard in London.
Get out of here.
When Jack the Ripper begins killing women in the West End. So his director of investigations is Sir Robert Anderson, who's also a Bible scholar. And sometime after the Ripper investigations, I think the early part, I think it was published around 1911 or 1915, he wrote a book called The Coming Prince, in which Sir Robert used his powers of investigation, applied it to the book to the Old Testament. In fact, he wrote one book called Daniel in the Critic's Den, a defense of the book of Daniel as authentic, in which he went through the prophecies in the book of Daniel. And there are a number of prophecies about things that were supposed to take place shortly after Daniel wrote, which would have been in the 6th century BC. He essentially prophesied the next few centuries of politics in the ancient Near East, the wars between the Syrian kingdom set up by one of Alexander the Great's generals and the Egyptian kingdom set up by one of Alexander's generals, with such detail that there are critics to this day who say the book of Daniel had to have been written after the fact because they nailed these details so precisely. But the thing is, the Hebrew Bible, what we Christians call the Old Testament, was translated into a Greek text called the Septuagint no later than about 200 BC, before some of these events had taken place. So regardless of whether Daniel himself wrote these words or not, the prophecies in them were fulfilled because we know they were translated from Hebrew into Greek before the events they foretold. So Sir Robert applied himself to that, and then he looked at this 70 weeks prophecy and realized, wait a minute, this was written in a day and age when a month had 30 days. It was a lunar calendar. It was not a 365-day year. It was a 360-day year. So he lays it out in his book called The Coming Prince, which you can find online. It's available because it's in the public domain now. It's out of copyright. And Sharon cited this in his book, that the date of Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild the city of Jerusalem took place probably on the 1st of Nisan. That's the first day of the new year, the religious year in the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar, in the year 445 BC. An era, and I'm quoting now from Anderson's book, an era, therefore, of 69 weeks or 483 prophetic years reckoned from 14th March BC 445 would close with some event to satisfy the words unto Messiah the Prince. In other words, the cutting off of the anointed one. Then he goes down and shows, and his final point here is he's going through bullet points, 1, 2, 3, 4, and he's numbering them. Point 11, the Julian date of that 10th Nisan was Sunday, the 6th of April, AD 32. What then was the length of the period intervening between the issuing of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the public advent of Messiah the Prince between 14th March BC 445 and the 6th April AD 42? And now he goes into all caps, like somebody, writing on Twitter.
Yeah, shouting at people.
he was writing this in all caps. The interval contained exactly and to the very day 173,880 days, or 7 times 69 prophetic years of 360 days, the first 69 weeks of Gabriel's prophecy. In other words, he was pointing out that Daniel decreed to the day the arrival of Jesus, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So not the cutting off of Messiah the Prince, but the arrival of Messiah into Jerusalem on April 6th in the year 32 AD. Daniel nailed it to the day. He even went so far as to consult the Astronomer Royal at Greenwich and quoted the letter back from the Astronomer Royal, who had his fellows look up the text. Okay, let's see, the first of Nisan and then 444, to the day, to the hour. That's the 70 weeks prophecy and the connection to Jack the Ripper, because Sir Robert Anderson worked on that investigation.
You know, that Robert Anderson you brought up there, I looked at some of his works that he's done. He has wrote masses of stuff about religious topics, you know?
He really did. And again, he applied this mind of a criminal investigator, into his study of the scriptures. And it's very clear, and you can tell by when reading his writing style, he did not suffer fools gladly. But the point is that 69 weeks concluded with Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem. The last week, the 70th week of Daniel's 70 weeks, we are in a pause between those, that 69th week and the start of the 70th week, which will kick off the what's called the time of Jacob's trouble, the 7-year period that is called the Great Tribulation. And again, as I mentioned earlier, because of the reference by Gabriel when giving this prophecy to Daniel, that these were decreed for your people, we presume that it means that 70th week will apply to the Jews, and that the church will not be here for that 70th week. Now, we may be wrong about that. That's an interpretation. If we're here through that period of tribulation, great tribulation, we're not going to argue about it. We're going to prepare as though we're going to be here for it, and hope that we get out of here before it. Jesus told his followers.
So where do you put us? Where are we now? I mean, are we getting close? I mean, and again, I'll emphasize that, you know, you're a man, you're Derek, you know, this is obviously speculation, but where are we, right, would you say?
We argue in the book that when you're looking at the book of Revelation, we believe that the first 5 seals of that 7-sealed scroll that Jesus takes from God when he arrives in heaven have already been opened. In other words, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are already out there riding. And the 5th seal, which is the one where the souls underneath the altar are crying out, "How long, O Lord? You know, when are you going to bring justice? When are you going to punish the evildoers and restore righteousness to earth?" We believe we are at that point. We're waiting for the 6th seal to open, which we think is when the church, those who've accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, will be caught up and taken out of the way. That's the massive earthquake that takes place. And that's when things really start to get nasty on earth, when the trumpet judgments start and we start seeing things like the flaming mountain that falls into the earth, and the wormwood hitting and turning the waters poisonous, and the abyss opening up, and these creatures coming out of the abyss, which we argue are the titans of Greek religion, because they're the only entities that we know for sure are in Tartarus, according to Peter and Jude, the angels who sinned, the watchers of Genesis 6, and if I didn't make it explicit before, I will now. We believe that those angelic beings who consorted with human women are to be equated with the titans of Greek religion.
Wow. I suppose my kind of opinion here, you look at 2020, people say it's been a crazy year. I've been telling people, hold on. It could just be the warm-up of things to come. Would you agree that it could be like the birthing pains, for lack of a better term, of where we're headed?
Absolutely. We're seeing things happening around us, Kev, and I don't mean to be hateful. I certainly don't want to come across that way, because we Christians have a bad habit of being the worst ambassadors for our King and his kingdom on this earth.
The judgiest people who should not be judging.
Right.
Yeah.
I heard it described this way once, and I think it's brilliant. We are not holier than thou. We are simply beggars who know where to get the free meal. And we should approach others with that level of humility. I mean, it doesn't mean we compromise on what is right and what is wrong, but we understand that those who are holding to a different understanding of, say, the proper roles of parents and children, relationships between adults and children, men and women and so on and so on. That was actually progressive when God gave that to Moses on Mount Sinai, as we talked in an earlier segment about the goddess Inanna, who was ancient when Moses was born. The morality, the code of morality that God gave Moses on Sinai, that was revolutionary for ancient Mesopotamia. And now we're being told that it is now hateful to suggest that a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl, regardless of what they claim to feel inside or regardless of what they do feel inside. Biology is coded into our DNA, and claiming you are something else does not make it so. That is considered hateful in this world. It is considered progressive to believe that gender is a fluid construct. But in actuality, that is actually regressive, because it's taking us back to a time that was old, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai.
When we were invoking the spirits of the dead and drinking drinks to them. Oh, that's right, we're back there again, see? That's why you can't separate the spiritual from the physical that's going on right now.
But the people who are holding these beliefs don't understand that they are essentially human shields. They are being used as human shields by the entities that the Apostle Paul told us are our real enemies, the real enemies of humanity, the ones who really want to destroy us, are the principalities and powers and rulers of the cosmic rulers of this present darkness. Evil intelligences, supernatural intelligences who want to do us harm. Not the people who are in front of them, who might be angry and screaming at us, calling us names. It's not us that they're shouting at. It's the one we serve. But there are some who might be saved if we approach them with gentleness and respect, as we are commanded. The Apostle Peter wrote this in one of his letters. Share the hope that we have, but with gentleness and respect. And that can be difficult to do. But if it was easy, we'd already be doing it. They wouldn't need to remind us. But we can, if we approach others with anger, with hatred, make ourselves even bigger stumbling blocks between them and the gospel that will save them. Now, there are some who will not listen regardless. To them, Jesus gave this instruction to the disciples. If any village will not listen, shake the dust from your sandals as a reproach and move on. It doesn't mean we shout back at them. It doesn't mean we get angry at them. They are to be pitied, actually, because they are in bondage and they don't recognize it.
Well said, brother. Well said. Now, you've mentioned the 4 horsemen, and I often joke when there's 4 people on the show, I see you're the 4 horsemen riding again. You and your wife go on to pin these entities down. They're very real. And you already said it, but they're already riding, all 4 of them, right?
Yes, we believe so. Revelation 4 makes it clear that the Lamb appears in heaven very quickly. Revelation 4 and 5, very quickly in heaven after John arrives there. We know from the letters of the apostles in the New Testament that Jesus was at the right hand of God the Father, well, by the time of the martyrdom of Stephen anyway, which was around the year 35 AD. So it would only make sense then that John was given a vision into the past of when the Lamb, Jesus, arrived in heaven and began opening those seals. Sharon pointed out some time back that since the 4th rider was named, Thanatos, death, which was a known entity in the Greek pantheon, and of course Hades comes with him. Hades also a known entity in the Greek pantheon. What about the others? Surely they must be entities as well. And so we started looking at the clues. The rider on the red horse is pretty easy to pin. That's the god of war, who, Ares and Mars to the Greeks and Romans. But we also identify him as Chemosh, who is the national god of Moab. And as I mentioned in an earlier segment, on that Moabite stone, Chemosh was equated with Athtar, which is the male aspect of the sex goddess Astarte. So Athar just happened to be the only deity that was worshipped by all of the Arabian tribes at the time of Muhammad and the time of the founding of Islam. So I go into more detail on that in my book, Bad Moon Rising. The rider on the black horse we think is really interesting. That one took a little work. He's the one that comes with scales and seems to symbolize famine. But the word in Greek, zugos, actually means yoke, like the kind of thing you put across the neck of oxen to get them to pull a plow. And we think that's really relevant to what we see in the world today, an economic slavery. COVID-19 is being used to push a concept called the Great Reset by the World Economic Forum, which is fundamentally a restructuring of human civilization on this earth into a new feudalism, destruction of the middle class, serfs on the bottom, lords and ladies on the top.
It's the system of the new age, right?
Yeah, and we argue that this entity is the Babylonian god Nabu, known later as Hermes or Mercury. Mercury is based on a Latin word that from which we also get commerce and merchant and merchandise. Nabu in ancient Babylon was the scribe who kept track of learning and reading, but also tracked all of the prophecies from the gods, also tracked kept the ledgers, who donated what to the king, who donated what to the temple, etc. In fact, they recently discovered a small temple in ancient Babylon to the god Nabu of accounts. So Nabu was the one who kept track of credits and debits. And boy, if we're not living in an age of economic slavery with credit cards and student loan debt and 30-year mortgages and 10-year auto loans,
you know,
here's
Derek,
the thing that I think
you could add into that Mercury as well, being because I was in the Royal Signals. That was our cat badge, and it was the god of the messengers. You know, the communications.
Right.
And you look at the Great Reset and how much of it relies on big data, technology, communications.
Right.
No surprise we see that kind of reflected in the time today.
And just as a final note, because this blew our minds when we stumbled across this little bit of information. Back in 2009, right after the great subprime mortgage meltdown and the financial crisis, MasterCard introduced a new fee that is paid by merchants on every transaction they take. And they could have called it anything, the service fee, whatever. But instead, somebody at MasterCard decided to call it the Network Access Brand Usage Fee. So in every transaction where you use a MasterCard, a merchant somewhere is paying 2 cents to Nabu.
Couldn't make that up.
I know.
Now, where does Artemis come into the story? Because we've got the Artemis Accords been signed as well now with the space thing going on with NASA. And what's Artemis represent?
Well, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo, and we actually argue that Apollo is the rider on the white horse. We notice that he rides forth with a crown, but the crown that he's wearing is not the diadem that we see later on Satan or on the beast that emerges from the sea. That's a crown of royalty. The Stephanos is a crown of victory that was given to winners at the Olympic Games. It later became the symbol of the Roman emperors, Julius Caesar and his successors. Apollo, we argue, went forth conquering and to conquer. And that his conquest was essentially Western civilization. I mentioned earlier that in the West, our system of government, our buildings, look at our government buildings in the West. They all look like pagan temples. We argue that Apollo's conquest was Western civilization.
Oh, Derek Gilbert, mind-blowing. Check the description for the links, folks. Wherever you are, make it TFR and did he touch that dial.